our topic is practice is the integration of desire. So this session and the next two other sessions, we're going to be talking about integration, which feeds in directly really to how we go about our practice, our long-term practice, so as to improve our judgment. The starting point then, really, I wanted to make the point that practice can work, but we shouldn't expect it to be instantaneous or absolute. So I got the two images here of an elephant, and because that hasn't really spoken to some people in the past, also an oil tanker as an alternative. So the key point here is that you can't instantaneously make an elephant or an oil tanker do what you want. You can't immediately shift it to do a quick turn in one direction or another. You have to plan ahead. You have to basically change the conditions in which the thing works, so that you're following its momentum or its will, but you're also exerting an influence on it. So the whole of us is like that, really. So our mind bodies and the whole way we've been set up by conditions tends to lead to this degree of flexibility, but not the kind of total flexibility we might prefer. So we can't change anything immediately, but we're not powerless either. So it's easy to fall into either of those two extremes, this free will and determinism extremes of thinking that we're either unable to act or totally omnipotent, as it were. So then I want to bring in the idea of integration then as the key other point. So we had integration last time, which Jim introduced, and integration is sort of crucial principle of the middle way, really, which runs through the sort of long-term adjustment of how we think about things. So it's kind of the flip side of the middle way, in that the positive expression of the middle way, if you like. Middle way is about avoiding absolutes, but integration is about bringing together positively things that are divided by those absolutes. Okay, so you had the image of the two mules last time, which gives you a basic model for integration and how integration works, and also its effect on our judgment. So one of the key points there was that conflict is created by absolutization. So if you think of the second and third pictures of the mules, then the mules are, they believe they've got the whole story. They're completely wrapped up in their belief, their contrary opposed beliefs that they need to be eating those separate piles of hay. So they're in an absolutized state, which is preventing them from engaging with the conditions. So they're also in a state of conflict. So that tells you something about the relationship between absolutization, getting caught up in an absolutized state, and conflict. So integration really is the resolution of conflict. And so we see the mules eventually resolve that conflict in the situation. So I see conflict as the central issue of practice and indeed of ethics. So really you can think in terms of two alternative models, really, that one of them is perhaps far more common, used in the way that people think about ethics and about practice than the other. So if you think of a conflict integration model, it's an alternative to a more common, what I would call a revelation rule repression model. Yeah, so a revelation rule repression model is the idea we need to improve ourselves or change how we behave in some way or how we think by following some sort of rule that we've decided is a good idea. But that kind of implies a revelation. It implies that we've got this source of absolutely correct information about what the correct rule should be. We know what is always right. And it also tends to create repression because the rule doesn't always fit, given that conditions keep changing. So that model doesn't always work. It doesn't always serve us very well. It creates conflict. And the alternative to that then is a conflict integration model. And so that's where we see the problem as basically lying in conflict. Either conflict within us or conflict between us and others, which comes to the same things. I'll say more about that in a minute. So if we see resolving conflict as our basic challenge, then that actually fulfills a lot of the same intuitions that we have about ethics, about how we should practice. But at the same time, it keeps it all within our experience. So we don't have to appeal to some sort of absolute source of authority from somewhere else in order to justify our rule. We just have to recognize that there are different bits of us that want different things. And maybe there's a long-term voice and a short-term voice. There's, for example, the part of you that has is very attached to a bad habit and doesn't want to give it up, and there's the longer-term one that wants to change that habit. So if you start thinking about that habit or that change you want to make in yourself in terms of conflict and integration, I think that's generally much more helpful. A lot of what we think of as rules about how we should behave, like avoiding violence, for example. Yeah. So you can think of violence as a bad thing, but rather than just thinking of violence intrinsically as a bad thing, you can think of violence as, well, something that it creates and exacerbates and disinhibits conflict. And that being the basic problem with it, it's a conflict both within ourselves and outside ourselves. So a little bit more about conflict then. So you can think of conflict at a psychological level within an individual, or a socio-political level between groups or between individuals. But either way, they're conflicts of desire. So somebody has to have the desire which conflicts with another desire. Groups are made up of individuals, and those individuals have desires which are different from the desires that people in other groups or other individuals have. So even when, even in a world war, the conflicting desires are ones that are created by people and their individual desires building up. Also it works the other way around, that we bring those socio-political conflicts into our own psyches. So think of the voice of your granny, what's sometimes called the superego, or somebody with an authoritative voice in your childhood that interferes at times that maybe you want to feel free, but there's this insistent authoritative voice coming up at the same time. So that's creating a conflict. Okay, there's the granny and this is the small child, and those are inside you, but they could also be in the world. Okay, so external problems, they're not necessarily dealt with better by absolutizing. That doesn't mean that there's no role for rules. It just means that the justifications we use need to be justifications which come from within our experience as far as possible. And internal conflicts, we can become aware of internal conflicts through things like body awareness, recognizing our inconsistencies, maybe things like dreams and fantasies, by recognizing that we're in a fragile state. So we've been repressing some sort of alternative wish we may have. A classic example of that is something like repressed homosexuality, leading to homophobia, somebody being very fragile in the way they interact because of a feeling they're repressing. So there can be internal conflicts and there can be external conflicts, and they're all closely interrelated to each other. And those conflicts are made up of desires. So desire is energy. And if we're using a conflict integration model, then I think it's important not to think of desires themselves as good or bad, but to recognize that they're energy which is flowing through our nervous systems. I mean, it's coming ultimately from glucose in our bodies. It's creating chemical and electrical changes and muscular movements and so on. But that system of our bodies is set up to channel those energies in particular ways, depending on meaning and belief, which we'll talk about more in future sessions. But that determines how the energy flows. So integration brings those energies together in the sense that the energy is concentrated to work together rather than working for different contradictory ends. It's working in the same way. So rather than driving your car backwards and then forwards again, going in the same sort of direction. There's an interview which Barry did in the podcast series with a guy called Arno Michaelis, which I'd highly recommend, who was is a reformed neo-Nazi. Very interesting interview. But one of the striking things he talks about is the way in which his hatred blocked his energies. So that's basically if you're trying to constantly rationalize this rigid view of a group of people, like the one that you're racially prejudiced against, then you've got to put a lot of energy into keeping that down, rather than putting that energy into the things you positively want to do. So that for me was a great example of that conflict at work in a particularly strong way, and in recognizing that was part of how he managed to get out of this state he was in and change his life. Okay, so integration, as in the two mules, is obviously the way out of this, and there was a whole range of practices that can help us with integration. And before this session, I sent out a chart which illustrates a lot of those practices, or shows the relationship between all those practices and desire, meaning, and belief. So in the short term, the integration of desire can be achieved by relaxing and contextualizing. So if our conflicts are caused by absolute beliefs, which are fixed perhaps in our left prefrontal lobes, and also fueled by loops of craving and anxiety, which I talked about in previous sessions, we can relax that process. We can relax those loops, and meditation is a classic way of doing that. And we relax basically by contextualizing, so that we're no longer possessed by those loops, thinking, yeah, that's all there is. We're no longer just filled with anxiety. Anxiety might still be there, but we've got a bigger context to put it into. So that can be really helpful, and it can feed into a longer term process as well. So there's the short term temporary integration, as I would call it, can be produced by meditation, for instance, or other allied body practices like yoga or tai chi or whatever. And there are lots of ways of describing temporary integration states, like the Buddhist tradition of talking about jhana states, or states of absorption. But it certainly involves deep relaxation. It often also involves very positive emotions and strong states of concentration, which come with that, which come from that concentration of uniting of energy. In the longer term, we can't just rely on these practices which produce short-term integration, because our beliefs have a longer-term effect on conflict and integration. So to change things in the longer term, we need to be able to question our frameworks. We need to be able to reframe rather than just relax. So that's why I think meditation, for example, is not enough by itself. You need something that works with meaning and belief to go with it, and to work at those other levels as well, in order to produce sustainable long-term integration. Just to summarize some of the practices that can particularly focus on desire. So I'll talk in subsequent weeks about meaning and belief related practices, but some general broad headings for types of practice. The meditation I've already mentioned, and bodily discipline. So they're working at an individual level on relaxing our conflicts, basically, you could say, and thus we may get a unification of energy temporarily coming from that, but it's very dependent on the states we've created in that particular context by doing that practice. But you could also think more negatively, just that there are certain interferences you might need to avoid, and ethical observances might help you there, just to avoid disruption to the possibility of relaxing your conflicts. So taking intoxicants might make your conflicts worse in some circumstances. So if you know that, then you might want to avoid them. So that's where I'd see possibly things like setting yourself a rule about how much you drink or whatever might well be useful. And then relationships of care and friendship and listening. There's a whole load of social practices there which can have a very similar effect at a social level. So they relax and contextualize. We give ourselves a new context, and we give our conflicts a new context by relating to others in a caring and positive way. And then finally, there's mediation and mediation techniques. Now, I think those do involve working both with desire and with belief, but often the beginning of a mediation process involves, again, contextualizing. So with NVC, nonviolent communication, the process there tends to start with getting two people in conflict to acknowledge each other's needs. So just giving a different context for the moment to the conversation, so that it's not dominated by the conflict. It begins to have other things going on that people recognize is going on. Okay, I better stop there and stop sharing. I'll stop sharing, that's it. Great. Okay, so any questions or thoughts? James?
Yeah, I was going back to the example of the neo-Nazi guy on the podcast. I mean, it sounds like cognitive dissonance played a part in his sort of shifting of perspectives, didn't it? And is that kind of part of what you think happens when integration occurs, that you resolve the cognitive dissonance that's occurring? And it's cognitive dissonance that is the energy sapping aspect of when you get very tired by trying to hold together sort of opposing positions.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. I mean, cognitive dissonance maybe connects more with the integration of belief, but it's certainly, I mean, it's all interconnected. So we can't entirely separate the integration of desire from that of belief. But yeah, that provides a whole way into this material. There are lots of possible ways into it, I think, really, from different disciplines and traditions, and the whole analysis of cognitive dissonance is one possible way into it.
Well, he described an example of a black woman being kind to him in a fast food place, and that sort of confused him because he couldn't kind of make sense of his supposed hatred of black people with this friendly woman who seemed to be quite kind towards him.
Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, so that's a good example of how we might start to reframe, because you know, some kind of disruption is required to our established, maybe absolutized way of doing things. Laura, you're muted.
This takes a point that James made. I would think that relationships of care can be longer term, in the sense that he was saying that something caring can be profound for people. And over a long period of time, I think it can have real long-term effects where you can integrate conflict better than you could in a short term.
Yeah,
right.
I agree with that. It's just that you know, those relationships can also reinforce shared belief structures. So
I see.
You could get, for example, I know, imagine a mafia gang, and there's a woman who cares for all the men in the mafia gang, and they're better because of her care, but that just reinforces what they're doing, criminality they're engaged in. So it can have, I think it, although it may happen repeatedly over time, in the sense that care can operate as, you know, to integrate beliefs, is more of a short-term thing than an inconsideration of beliefs.
You were saying that reframing works with meaning and belief, and I can see how that's what you're talking about there. Yeah.
I mean, there is also, I suppose, reframing so as to start caring more. That could be, but that's changing your beliefs about other people. I would stick that in those terms. Any other thoughts? Bridget.
One little thing that always stays with me is reframing. When someone in Zimbabwe, actually, a young guy was hijacking someone in a car with a knife, might have been a gun, and the person had a very calm presence. They said, what do you think your mother would say to you?
Yeah.
And it kind of totally disrupted his belief system, so it didn't feed into it. I just thought that was a funny, it was just always stayed with me.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. If you ever have wasted time by watching some of these cops programs, which mostly involve hauling drug addicts out of badly driven cars, it's very noticeable that where you have the domestics, that sort of approach works far better than a confrontational one. In fact, I was having a conversation today with some similar ex-teachers, and the same point was made, that type of approach works far better than the sort of pin them against the wall of the gymnasium approach. A certain, I won't mention a particular branch of teacher, but a certain style of teaching.
Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts?
Yeah, I always wonder when I see the mule example that mules probably aren't great examples of good communicators, and humans aren't either. Also, one mule is probably stronger than the other, so it could probably drag the other towards its favored heap. In real world conflicts, they do tend to be a lot more complex than that example, even though I like that example very much. It doesn't pay to analyze it too much.
Yeah, it's just an example, yeah. I mean, obviously with any, to apply the general principle to any particular specific real experience example, you've got to take into account the details of that.
Yeah, I think that gets the message across. It's a very graphic example. Works quite well. The trouble is, in politics too, you get groups, some that are far more powerful than others. So, you know, nothing is quite so simple.
Yeah, but then that's part of the set of conditions that you're working with. So in applying the middle way, you've got that to work with, but then you've got things that you want to have to modify that state of affairs. So even if there are very negative state of affairs in which a lot of power is being exerted on one side, you can work with that state of affairs in whatever ways possible. Yeah, like Bridget's example, I mean, you can come up with unexpected correction.
Can I add to that, Robert, with a question? Because I really liked your video on this topic too, the slides in that, and the focus on the problem of conflict of desires that happen with loops inside the brain in a similar situation. But regarding external conflicts too, I think you make a very good point about how integration is different from repression. So repressing desires can, at least in the psychoanalytic sense, can lead to the projection of them onto others, and then more external conflict at the same time. But the meditation, approach is really helpful in my own experience to not just the mediating the internal loops of conflicting desires, but also realizing when I'm projecting them on others. So is when you talk about integration of desire, the emphasis seems to be persons internally, but are we also talking about trying to move towards the possibility of that with our opponents in politics or in daily life?
Exactly, yeah. I think it's the realistic way of bringing resolution even in socio-political conflicts, in the sense that you're not likely to change somebody else's view of something that's in conflict with you unless they change their psychological state sufficiently. So you could see it more as helping them to change their psychological state so that they're a bit more integrated and recognize your view, and also changing obviously your view so that you recognize their view, so that you're no longer absolutized against each other. So I think it's practice that applies just as much at a socio-political level. And obviously there's a lot more I could say about the application of this in politics, which is a complex area. I hope maybe in the next set of talks we can have maybe some sessions on politics.
Is this a process though that requires time? Very often we find ourselves, I mean, I remember what came to my mind was a rather nice meeting I had with an ex-veteran at the American War Memorial just outside of Luxembourg about a year ago, where now very clearly his admiration of the current American president and his process of solving America's problems was not one that I shared. And clearly it would have taken a great deal of time to us to come to some sort of meeting of minds on this. And in the end, you in a sense have to disengage and walk away from it, because you know that this is not the place, not the situation in which this sort of coming together can occur.
Yeah, indeed. So that could be a realistic response to a conflict. If you recognise that you can't resolve the conflict, then you might have to make the judgment that it's better to avoid the conflict. Yeah, there's the judgment involved there, isn't it, as to whether you're just being cowardly or whether you're being wise in the avoidance of conflict. A tricky one.
Sometimes, though, it does take a very clear mind to actually state a position. I found myself once in Zimbabwe again with one of Mugabe's closest friends, who I actually happened to be working with, and I found myself saying something I never thought I would. She was justifying a lot of the invasions and the violence, and I said, "What you're doing is wrong. I'm deeply ashamed of what the British did. It does not make what you're doing right. And one day I hope that you will understand that and realize what you're doing is wrong." And that night, I was so amazed that I said it. I thought, well, I'm going to be deported now for absolutely sure. And she phoned me and she said, "Thank you, Bridget. You're the only person who's ever spoken to me like that." So I just throw that in, and it surprised me that I said it. Yeah. And then sometimes we are called on to speak without not working with, it's beyond desire, it's something bigger.
Well, an intuition of a more integrated perspective, perhaps. And it's very difficult to sort of predict when that's the right thing to do, isn't it? But yeah, your intuition served you well.
It was also the manner in which you said it, though, because if one says it in a competitive or angry or conflicting way or judgmental way, that can backfire. So it's probably to your credit how you spoke as well.
Yeah.
It totally surprised me that I was able to do that. But you're right, it's an integrated position.
I also thought it was interesting thinking about the things that Robert talked about, relaxing, contextualizing, and reframing. I thought it was remarkable that you contextualized it with yourself in terms of what the British had done. And that made it not just something where someone else was all wrong. And also that there was an element of relaxing the situation to begin with.
Yeah.
That's true.
There is the issue of whether you feel that you're empowered by a greater power. There is, for example, the business of the Quaker delegation that travelled all the way across Europe, all the way into Germany by as far as the trains went in the time of the Crimean War, and then by stagecoach and sledge to tell the Tsar, I beseech thee in the bowels of Christ that thee may be wrong, or whatever, and trying to insist that he did desist from the Crimean War. I think he spoke very politely back to them, but clearly they were not, in a sense, they were speaking from personal conviction, but it was a sort of greater, higher conviction, and I'm not sure that works. Clearly they didn't get the result they wanted, these sober-coated gentlemen who turned up at his court and kept their hats on, but it's and they tried it also, I think, with the Grand Turk at one point and got a similar response, but I think Bridget is right that when you speak out of your own guts, out of your own feeling, it works. When you claim that that you have the supreme authority, it doesn't.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, that takes us into the whole area of how much to rely on intuition, which I think is a very interesting one. But we should probably stop there because we're way over time. So a bit break up into our groups. So I will just stop the recording.